In just a minute here. Hey everyone, welcome to Catholic Culture's first ever live stream on YouTube, a whole new thing for us. So this should be fun. My name is Thomas Miras. If you are a frequent viewer of our YouTube channel or a listener of our podcasts, you might know me. I direct the Catholic Culture Podcast Network, occasionally write for CatholicCulture.org, and today we're going to be doing a live stream Q&A with Mike Aquilina, who is an author of many books on the early church and the fathers of the church, and the host of our very popular Way of the Fathers podcast. And we'll be doing some fundraising because we're in the middle of one of Catholic Culture's 2 yearly fundraising campaigns. So welcome, everybody. We're going to have some fun. Before too long, I'll be opening it up for viewer questions for Mike, anything you want to ask him about the early church. But I'll go ahead and welcome him now. Mike, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Thomas. It's an honor.
Well, before we get to our conversation, there's a little bit of business I have to take care of because this is a fundraising live stream. I'll try to get through the business as quickly as possible, though. All right, so to break it down, this is a live stream for the website CatholicCulture.org, and people who only listen to our podcasts on YouTube might not be aware that this is just an extension of this website that's been around a lot longer than the YouTube channel. The website Catholic Culture has existed since 2003, and we've got all kinds of Catholic news, commentary every week, a large library of Catholic documents, resources for living the liturgical year, and of course we've got our 4 podcasts, all of which are represented on this YouTube channel, the Catholic Culture Podcast, which I host, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, which I co-host, and our most popular podcast, Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina, which has been going since October 2019, I believe. Now, Mike, the way that we first got in touch was that you sent me an email about some articles that I had been writing about the Church Fathers on CatholicCulture.org.
Yeah, it was a great series. Yeah.
Thank you. And that eventually led to this working relationship, and you're doing this podcast, but it also indicates that you were an occasional, at least, reader of CatholicCulture.org. So since we're fundraising here, I might as well throw it to you and get your take on our postulate here.
No, I mean, CatholicCulture.org has been my source for daily news as long as it's been available on the web. I mean, I've known Phil Lawler since before I knew there was a World Wide Web, and I knew him to be a trusted journalist. So I've read what I could from Phil as long as I've known Phil, and that must be about 30 years now. So I when I heard about CatholicCulture.org and that it would be running Phil's fledgling news service way back when, that's when I started tuning in. There I discovered Jeff Miras, who in my opinion writes the best think pieces you can find today. Jeff has the ability to gain clarity and charity and on modern on the issues as they're breaking in the news. I just don't know anybody who does it better than Jeff. So he's formed my opinions on the issues more than anybody else, I think. I find a wisdom, clarity, reliability at CatholicCulture.org that I just have not found anywhere else, and I've been relying on it for a long time. I actually didn't know it was that email that planted the idea of the podcast in your head. I was just enjoying your series on the Fathers, and I wanted you to know that.
Well, I mean, the idea came later, but it was the beginning of our relationship, and then later, when I had the idea for the podcast, I thought, well, Mike is the one that should do it. Or actually, I think
it's great that CatholicCulture.org was the one place on earth that would run a series of articles on the Church Fathers. And that's what you were doing at the time. Right. And that made such an impression on me that someone would take the time to do this and do it right, because the series is still up there on the website and it's still excellent.
Yep. I think I stopped after the School of Alexandria. I don't think I got any further than that, but now we've covered the whole group with season 1 of the Way of the Fathers. And
Yeah.
for people who don't know, Way of the Fathers again started in October 2018, and it's started with just I think what was it, a 52 or 62 episode, I forget which, overview of all of the major fathers of the church. And then we did we've been doing some sort of one-off episodes on different topics in
Oh
early
yeah.
Christianity. And then the second season dealt with the first ecumenical councils of the church. And now, well, we'll get to your third season in a minute. I have to talk a little bit more about the fundraiser before we do that, but you've just started your third season of Way of the Fathers, which is quite exciting. So all right. So like I said, CatholicCulture.org, we're in the middle of our May fundraising campaign. It's called our Queen of the May campaign. We are entrusting our apostolate to Mary, Help of Christians, I believe, on whose feast the campaign ends. And that'll go from, well, we're about a week in now. It started on May 1st, and it'll end on May 24th. And some generous donors have pledged a $50,000 matching challenge grant. So from now until May 24th, any donations that you make will be doubled if we make the $50,000 mark. So in other words, at the end of that, if we make the $50,000 mark from just our ordinary donors, then we will have that doubled to $100,000 to help us continue for basically the rest of the year. Now, after a week, we've already nearly raised our first $10,000, which is a good sign. The first 10-20% of that challenge is always the hard part. Things usually get a slow start. But your donations, any donations that our viewers give, will help us to get to our first 10,000, and then we'll be about 20% of the way there. If we get there tonight, that would be great, because we have just, I think, about 16 days, just about 2 weeks left to go in this campaign. We've decided to do a shorter campaign than usual, so we bug people less with emails, and hopefully are able to fundraise more efficiently. And part of the reason that we're doing these live streams is to try to, rather than just asking people for money, to actually give them something that they'll enjoy as part of the fundraising process. So we're trying to be a little more creative here. And so yeah, how can you donate? There are three main ways to donate. You can go to CatholicCulture.org/donate, and the link for that is in the description of this video. That's tax deductible. Now, if you don't want to sign up on our website, or you haven't already done so, you can also go to PayPal using the link in the description for this video, and that is also tax deductible. There's a third option, perhaps the most convenient option. Right here on YouTube, you can send us a super chat in the live chat, and I don't believe those are tax deductible. And also, I will say that I found out that Google or YouTube takes a significant cut of those super chat donations. So they take about 30%, if you can believe it. And not only that, if you're using YouTube through the Apple App Store, Apple takes 30%, and then Google takes 30% of what's left. So what I've read from people who have used this is that you end up getting about, the creator gets about 45% of what's donated if it's an Apple and Google, and about 70% if it's not going through the Apple App Store. So feel free to donate on that if that's the only way you want to do it. And there's fun aspects to the super chat as well. So I understand if people want to use that, but just be aware, if you want all of your donation to go to us directly, then you want to use, and be tax deductible, of course, you want to use CatholicCulture.org or PayPal. Again, both of those links are in the description. Also, if you're donating via CatholicCulture.org or PayPal, please let us know in the chat so we can thank you. So we'll be opening it up to questions in a little bit, but there's a couple things that I'd like to ask you about, Mike, before we do that. And one of those is that you've just started your third season of Way of the Fathers, and you are talking about important cities of the early church. And what gave you that idea?
when you talk about the fathers, you see that so much of their character came from the cities where they lived. So much of what they did was a response to their circumstances and their particular culture. So you have cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and each of these had a particular character, a kind of personality to the city. It was known for certain things. It had certain distinctive characteristics, certain loves and certain hatreds and certain tendencies, like a tendency to riot and that sort of thing. So there were, these cities were known for known for certain qualities. And I want to bring those out in this series. Where did the idea come from? Well, it kind of gradually snuck up on me as I was doing the other series because I was writing about the fathers. I had to write about their historical setting, and it was natural to write about their geographical setting. Where they were living, what they were doing, how that affected their work, their words, the course of their lives. And then of course that went double for the series on the councils, because the setting of the council was usually chosen for particular reasons, for political reasons usually, and and that made it interesting as well. So it was kind of a natural movement from the first and second series to the third. Uh, it took me some time to do the research because I didn't want to just do the cities that had the major reputations. I wanted to get out into the lesser known cities, get into Armenia and a few other places. So I've had to do a lot more digging. Eventually, I'm going to have to figure out how to pronounce all these names of cities I didn't know particularly well before I started doing the research. So just kind of organically grew out of the first two series, I guess.
So what are some of the cities you'll be covering in season 3?
Well, the big ones I've already mentioned: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome. Those are the four biggies of the ancient church. I want to also do Alexandria, I want to do Constantinople. Constantinople arrives on the scene a little bit later in the 4th century, but it becomes a very important city in the history of the church and in the centuries that followed, obviously. Is a site of several of the church councils. So there's Constantinople, there's Lyon in France, there's Milan in Italy, and Ravenna in Italy. So many of these cities were homes to the great fathers and lesser known fathers. So it'll be an opportunity to tell a lot of stories about how the cities developed over time. A few of the cities I mentioned ended up being capitals of the Roman Empire. So there are interesting stories to go along with that as the capitals moved from place to place, from Rome to Milan to Ravenna, and why did that happen? What effect did it have on the life of the church and the lives of the fathers in particular?
Right. Now, are there major differences in how the church is sort of organized in its structure from city to city early on?
No, I mean, you don't find major differences, and that's best illustrated, I think, by the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, which were set down around 107 AD. Now, Ignatius is an old man by that time, and he's going from Antioch, his home, to Rome to die. He had been tried as a Christian in Antioch, but he was to be executed. His sentence was to be carried out in Rome. And scholars ask why this happened. Usually Roman law and most kinds of law demand that a man be executed where he's tried. But Ignatius was sent to a faraway land, and I think it was because he was recognized as a celebrity. He was the bishop in Antioch, so he was an important figure in the church in one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. The city, in fact, where the disciples were first called Christians. So Ignatius would have been either the immediate successor or the second successor of St. Peter. So again, there's this identification of him with an office that has some prestige. It has the association with one of the apostles. Ignatius writes 7 letters along his way to Rome, 6 of them to churches, 1 of them to a bishop in one of the churches, a bishop named Polycarp. and they're fascinating letters because they really do give us a window onto the life of the church at that time. One of the things that's interesting is that Ignatius doesn't really argue for the doctrines or the practices of the church. He doesn't make arguments. He just assumes that these things are universal, and he refers to the church as Catholic, as universal. That this is something that we can just assume is the same in every place. And one of the things he assumes is the structure of the church. That every church consists of a certain structure that includes bishop, presbyters, deacons, and the laity. This is assumed in all of his letters. It's asserted in a couple of places, and it comes through very strongly. It's consistent from letter to letter. And again, the letters are written to the churches in different cities, and in every place he just assumes that it's the same deal, so to speak. 107 A.D. If you look at other artifacts from that time, if you look at the letter of Clement of Rome, you'll find something similar as well. I mean, Clement doesn't use the terminology as specifically, as explicitly as Ignatius does, but Clement kind of shows us what it looks like in practice. Okay, Clement is writing a letter of discipline from the Church of Rome to a distant church, Corinth in Greece, and he's assuming that he will be heeded, he will be obeyed, that his letter will carry some weight in this distant church. Clement seems to be acting as a monarch ruler, someone who's who has authority over his church, the Church of Rome. And he even makes some remarkable assertions in the course of his letter. He says that his letter, he refers to his letter as the words written by us through the Holy Spirit. So he's claiming a certain divine guarantee on the teaching that he has in his letter. It's a very long letter, and it's a letter of discipline, as I said, and it goes through the Old Testament. He and the New Testament, and he gives Old Testament and New Testament backup for all the claims he makes, including the claims about order and authority within the church. He shows how this has just always been the way God works in the cosmos and in history. So he shows that there's a certain order to the universe, a natural order to the winds and the waves and so on, but also that God imposed a certain order on his people in Israel. And he describes the Levitical priesthood and how it's set up. And he said that it has an analog in the church, and he explains what that is. And he exhorts the Corinthians to follow that order as it's been established by Jesus Christ. So this is what we find in the early church, and it's confirmed by later writers. And by later, I mean, the middle and the end of the 100s. Writers like Irenaeus of Lyon, Polycarp of Smyrna. We find the same kind of thing in their writings. It was there in the New Testament. The structure was there, and we see it in the Church of Jerusalem, where James ruled as a monarch bishop, and that's just the structure that was followed ever afterward. It's interesting in Eusebius when he's talking about the monepiscopacy. He's talking about it as something that's established in Acts chapter 15, and followed by the church ever afterward. And it's from there that he talks about the succession of bishops in Jerusalem, and he gives the succession of bishops in Rome, and I believe he does Antioch and Alexandria as well in the same place. So yes, this is something that is universal, even though they don't always use the precise terminology that we'd like them to use, the terminology that we developed later on for understanding this, but that's to be understood. It's early in the history, and they're just learning to use the language with it.
Right. Now, this leads me to a question that's come up in the comments on some of our YouTube videos in recent weeks. For whatever reason, thanks to the YouTube algorithm, your old episode, I think episode 3 of the Way of the Fathers podcast, that is the first church father individual father you ever covered on the podcast, St. Clement of Rome, Pope St. Clement I, as we would call him. Now, that video on YouTube just blew up to become, I think, it might be our most viewed video on the channel now. I might be mistaken about that, but it's definitely got to be in the top 3. And so we got some new comments on the video, and we had a number of people. I don't know. Some of them may be Catholic, some of them may be Orthodox or Protestant. Some somewhat, in some cases, somewhat challenging questions about the government of the Church of Rome relating to Saint Clement. That is, people were asking if there's actually any contemporary evidence that Rome, like Antioch or some of the people that St. Ignatius was writing about, had a monepiscopacy, a monarchical bishop, and also, is there any documentation, contemporary documentation, that Clement was the Bishop of Rome at this time? How much of that is just a later tradition ascribed? One person asked, is there any correspondence between St. Peter and Clement, that, for example, that we have recorded? Now, I felt safe in telling him, no, we don't have anything like that. But I wanted to know about any other kind of evidence that might be convincing to someone who's skeptical, because we can sort of get an impression from Ignatius's letter to the Romans and from the what we call the letter of Clement to the Corinthians, that I think both of those together are pretty convincing of the primacy of Rome in some general sense, at least.
Yeah.
So the question then is connecting the dots with the monarchical Bishop of Rome and with Clement in particular.
Yeah. I have to apologize for not seeing the comments when this was blowing up, as you mentioned, in the last couple of weeks. I've been overseas. I didn't take my laptop with me, and I just can't. These old eyes cannot read comments on YouTube videos on my little phone screen. So I owe an apology for that. I came home to find my dog dying, so I had to deal with that until today, when the dog died. So this is my first time to break free. So again, I haven't seen the comments, but I will reply to you as you've summarized them, and try to work with that. You mentioned Clement and the way his letter was treated. What we find, within 100 years, is that the letter was treated as scripture in many places, that it was considered canonical scripture. So this is a disciplinary letter that it came out of Rome to deal with a problem in a faraway church, and it's Clement kind of exhorting these people to return to order. And what we find, within 100 years, is that in Corinth, among the people who receive the letter, they're reading it aloud in the liturgy, which is a privilege that's extended only to the canonical scriptures, but they're treating it like scripture. It shares a kind of extreme authority, an apostolic authority. At least that's what they're perceiving in that church, because we have a letter of Dionysius of Corinth, who writes to the Pope at that time, telling him that they do this with the letter of the Bishop of Rome, Clement. So what we find later on, and just a little bit later on, really, is that Irenaeus of Lyon writes about apostolic succession, and when he writes about apostolic succession, he chooses the Church of Rome as his exemplar, and he says he talks about it as a special case because it enjoys primacy, and he gives the succession down to his own time. So he's doing this about 170, 180 AD. And he's talking about monepiscopacy. He assumes that it was always the case in Rome, and he's living pretty close to the time. Remember, Irenaeus is the one who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So the succession from the apostles to Irenaeus is just, it isn't even a hop, skip, and a jump. It's just a hop and a skip. He's that close to the apostolic time, the apostolic succession. And he looks back on the chain of popes in Rome, and he sees them as 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 monarch bishops within the city during that time, and also monarch bishops over the church as well. That little tiny passage where he introduces the list of succession is one of the most debated about passages in the Fathers.
Right.
It's much discussed.
Hmm.
Anyway, so you're not going to find that document that you would like, that is a letter, as you put it before, of St. Peter to St. Clement saying, hey, here are the keys, you can use my car, you
Right.
can you can there, I left some food in the fridge, that kind of thing. You're just not going to find that kind of thing. So you have to look at the way they talk about the office, the way they talk
Right.
about the church, the way they talk about the structure, and say, what does that look like? And it looks a lot like what they were doing in the next generation, but calling by the more precise names. That they were calling the offices by those names. And you say, well, it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's probably a duck.
Yeah, and those are pretty close to contemporary,
Mhm.
as you pointed out. But
Yeah.
I would say even within the documents themselves, and particularly the letter of Clement to the Corinthians and the letter of Ignatius to the Romans, I think taken together, I would be willing to concede perhaps that the letter of Clement taken on itself is not a slam dunk
No.
for the primacy of Peter as Catholics understand it. Like if I was talking to an Orthodox person who was disputing that, I wouldn't try to make
Mhm.
it say more than it does. Um, Taken together with that, the greeting that Ignatius gives to Rome, which is so much longer than the greetings that he gives just about anybody else in his
Right.
letters, and some of the remarkable phrases that he uses, and I'd encourage people to go check that out. I think those are very a solid confirmation of the primacy of Rome, and so it's a question of, okay, who was the Bishop of Rome? Why was Rome considered primacy? Was it an imperial thing? All these different doubts that people might raise, but I think that Rome was given accorded primacy, even if it may, if some as some people claim, be a council of elders or something like that. At very least, I think that's quite established
Yeah.
within those texts themselves.
But I think there's a good precedent for monepiscopacy, even before the New Covenant. I don't think it's a New Covenant innovation. I do
Hmm.
think it's a slight development of an Old Covenant institution. In the Old Covenant, you have the succession of high priests, and there's a lot of emphasis placed on that. That it is a monarchy. It's one man who occupies that office. And
Right.
in Josephus, we even find a list of the men who held the office in sequence. So this is the authoritative list. And that passage in Josephus resembles the passages in Irenaeus and Eusebius, and even the discussion of apostolic succession that we find in Clement of Rome. So it's not like the Christians are coming out of nowhere with this. And,
Right.
and certainly not like they're coming out of nowhere in the 3rd century with this, because there's no evidence that there was a revolution later on that established a monepiscopacy across the board.
Right.
If that had been a late establishment, you better believe there would have been rebellion at the time, because that would have been seen as a threat,
Right.
as a violation of apostolic precedent, and you would have heard a lot of it. There would have been quite a paper trail for that, and it probably would have even been documented by the pagans who were
Right.
persecuting the church at that time. They would
Yeah.
have pointed out that these Christians can't even agree on this right now. So there would be plenty of evidence for it, but there's no evidence of a revolution. There's plenty of evidence as kind of a peaceful handing on of the apostolic tradition regarding the structure of the church. It just gradually develops over time, and the language that we use to describe it develops as well.
Now, I'm going to open it up to questions in just a minute, but just one last comment I want to make on that is that looking at it, say, from an Orthodox perspective, now the Orthodox, they obviously accept apostolic succession, not that Christ gave this authority to the apostles and then it was somehow just evaporated after them. And they also, I think, accept that Peter was had some. Well, some of them may accept that Peter had primacy among the apostles. I guess some of them might debate that as well. But what doesn't make sense to me, and certainly many Protestants also accept that Peter had primacy among the apostles, although some would dispute it. Is why would Christ give the apostles this authority which is to be passed down, and Peter this authority which is not to be passed down? I mean, why would he set it up? Why do you need one chief apostle even at the beginning if you don't need it, immediately after his death or in perpetuity? It doesn't make sense that would just be a temporary arrangement if the apostolic succession is a permanent thing.
Yeah, I think you need a place where the buck stops, and you need someone in ultimate authority to say no or to say yes to developments as they're happening. I think that the position of Peter and the just the reality of his successors has made the Catholic Church pretty limber in its ability to deal with developments throughout history.
Right.
Especially into modernity. The fact that we have a pope who could sit as judge over these developments, who can respond to them in an authoritative way, who can summon a council, and get the bishops of the church together to discuss what's happening and to issue some kind of authoritative statements on it. This simply is not possible outside the Catholic Church, and the simple reason is that there's no pope. In the absence of a pope, you will often find at least several popes, but sometimes many popes. You'll have all of these people vying to be that one voice who's going to represent the Church of Jesus Christ. And I think that we see that happening in many parts of the Christian world today.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, we only have a few people here in the comments, it looks like, but I'd like to open it up for anybody who is viewing and would like to ask Mike any questions about the Church Fathers, early church, even anything else. If you're familiar with his career or anything else you want to ask him about, so yeah, Tom, I don't know if you're still there. You made a comment there that I highlighted a bit ago. Do you have any questions, or anybody else? If not, we'll just sort of ramble on until somebody asks a question. But I'm happy to field any questions that people might have. Well, I'll wait for people to formulate their questions. And well, let me ask you. You were just in Sicily, and you have seemed to go there regularly. How often do you go to Sicily?
I've only been there twice. I was there last year on
okay.
business, and I came back, and I was telling my sisters about it. And my oldest sister said that she really would like to go to Sicily someday. She had never been there, and it's the land of all four of our grandparents. So I put together a trip for my siblings, a couple of their spouses, and myself. And we did a grand tour of the island over the course of 8 days and had a great time. Of course, I saw the sites associated with many of the figures of antiquity. So it was kind of a rush for me. We went to the Valley of the Temples near Agrigento. Saw the place where Icarus flew too close to the sun and came to land on Earth, and I got to think about the relationship of men like Pope Gregory, the Gregory the Great to Sicily, Pope Leo the Great to Sicily, and especially the figures of the great martyrs of Sicily, who we remember in the Roman canon, in the Great Eucharistic Prayer, the first Eucharistic Prayer, Saint Lucy and Saint Agatha, because they are everywhere on that island. You go into all of these little churches, and every church has to have an image of Lucy and an image of Agatha. So it gave me a chance to meditate on their witness and on the revolution that they represent in the place of women in the world, the place of women in society. Because they were remarkable. They were virgin martyrs at a time when both virgin and martyr were just incomprehensible categories to the pagans.
Yeah, I remember. Did you ever read that recently translated biography of Gregory the Great by a German author that Ignatius put out, I think, last year?
No, I
They
would like
talk.
to read that.
Yeah, you should. It's good. They talk quite a bit about his love for Sicily and the Sicilian saints, and his management. His what is it? I forget if it was his donation of land to. He was involved with some monasteries in
Yes,
Sicily and
yes,
patronizing them as pope and things like
right.
that.
It
I
seems
think he
that
was also hiding out in one. I think it was in Sicily, or maybe it was just in the mainland of Italy when they came and demanded that he accept the bishopric of Rome.
yeah. Well, he either his family owned extensive land holdings in Sicily, or the church owned extensive land holdings in Sicily. Sicily was really important to Roman life at the time, because Sicily was the breadbasket of Rome. So Sicily was growing the wheat, growing the grain that fed the Italians in the peninsula, especially in the capital. So
Hmm.
Gregory was very much concerned about the economy of Sicily, for example. But he was also, of course, concerned about the church in Sicily. Sicily is kind of a strange place. It had a Greek culture early on, and it seems to have considered itself to be more Greek than Latin through the time of the fathers,
Hmm.
because you find these letters from the popes, from Leo and from Gregory, just reminding uh, the church in Sicily that it's supposed to be receiving new Christians at Easter Vigil, and not on the feast of the baptism of the Lord, as they do in the Eastern Church.
Huh.
That's one of the
Wow.
things that they had to be reminded of. Another thing was that they had to be reminded that only celibate males should be ordained to the priesthood, because in Sicily they considered themselves Greek, and they tended to uh, to ordain married men. So they were constantly being reminded about these things. Sicily is a very interesting place, and its position as somehow between East and West, or both East and West, made it important as the Byzantine Empire grew more dominant
Hmm.
in geopolitics, and there was a stretch of time that 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 when a lot of the popes were taken from Sicily for that reason.
Hmm.
They were Sicilians, so they had a strong understanding of Greek culture, but they also had that proximity to Rome, so they had some understanding of Rome as well. I made a visit to the church of Pope Leo II, Saint Leo II, which is in Agrigento. Last time I was in Agrigento, that's where I went to mass every day. So I made a visit there last week, and Leo was one of those popes, those Greek popes who served from Sicily. Sicily is just a remarkable place for many reasons, and you can't blame them for wanting to retain their Greek culture. So much of the Odyssey, so much of Greek mythology
Hmm.
takes place in Sicily,
Yeah.
and
Fascinating. Yeah.
yeah.
Jeff in the comment says rambling on is fine. Fascinating. Uh, um,
That's
uh,
all I do, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Although this is supposed to be a Q&A, so I hope we get at least one question by the time from the listeners by the time we're done with this. This is also, let me remind people, a fundraiser for CatholicCulture.org, so we can keep going for the rest of the year. So
Yeah.
if you would, please consider donating. You can find various donation links in the description here, but we're trying to meet a $50,000 matching grant by May 24th. So anything you can give would be appreciated.
And please
Um,
do. I mean, this is a mission I so much believe in. It's something that I was a fan of CatholicCulture.org for decades before I got the invitation to start the podcast. So again, it's something I believe in. I don't know any other place on the web, on the planet, that would take popular patristics so seriously that they'd want to do first a series of articles and get them out there for people to read, and then this podcast, which they've been so kind to produce and promote for 4 years now, and I've got them planned into the future.
Great.
So they're behind it very much, and I'm grateful for that. I just don't know any other place where that could happen, and I'm so grateful. I'd be willing to sit in a dunk tank on the web, and let people take aim at me. I believe in what's happening at CatholicCulture.org. I don't think it's happening anywhere else. I certainly don't think it's happening at such a high level.
Well, thank you, Mike. And the fact is that it's because we run on donations that we're able to start some of these podcast projects. That maybe I don't know. Yours of all the podcasts would be the most likely to be a commercially viable for-profit type product, whether as a book or a series of articles or whatever. But it's I do feel privileged to be in a position to think of an idea for a podcast and find someone like you to be able to do it. I really hope that we'll be able to continue to do these kinds of things in the future. I see that one more person has entered. We've got 5 people viewing now, and let me ask you, new viewer, to please ask Mike a question about anything you want to know about the early church, the church fathers, Mike's career, his work as a songwriter, any of those things that you want to ask him about, so that I don't have to keep coming up with questions. I'm enjoying it, and
I am too.
It's taking me back to the first podcast we ever did together, because this was before Way of the Fathers, but I think I had a guest drop out, and I thought, you know what, based on our emails, I think Mike would be able to just have a conversation without any real plan or preparation. And so it worked out great, because I just needed someone. I said, Mike, will you just come on and just have an unscripted, unprepared conversation? And it worked out well. So yes, you are a good rambler, for sure.
Well, you and I have a lot of common interests too.
Yeah.
So every time I see you, every time we sit down together, anytime we pick up the phone or whatever, we can range in conversation from patristics to poetry to music to all kinds of things, because we share these things in common. And I think a lot of people share them in common with us, so they can have fun while we're doing it.
Right. So Jeff has a question. Have you thought about the role of charity in the earliest church? Now, Jeff, I assume, I don't know what you mean by charity, but I would assume you're talking about like more in the modern sense of that word, because obviously charity, meaning the theological virtue of charity, would be a very, very broad question. So I'm assuming you mean almsgiving, that sort of thing. Oh, okay. He elaborates, in the last several years, I have read several of Peter Brown's books on late antiquity, lately his book on charity and poverty. Now, Jeff, I don't know which book you're referring to, but I have read his book, The Ransom of the Soul, and I wrote a review of it years ago on Catholic Culture. A really great book. It's about the relationship between wealth and the afterlife in early Christianity. Yeah, Mike's showing his copy of it there. But so
also
now,
this one.
I have it. I have that one too. I haven't read it yet. I've been slowly making my way through his short book on the cult of the saints. Yes, Jeff mentions John Chrysostom's sermons on Lazarus and the rich man. Let me throw something out there too, and we can get talking about this topic Jeff just brought up. I'm rereading The Shepherd of Hermas right now. Such a great little odd work of the apostolic
Very
era.
odd.
And
Very odd.
yeah, I've been in a discussion group with some people, actually mostly Orthodox. I've been the only Catholic in most of these discussions, a couple of Protestants and a bunch of Orthodox. And it's through this sort of Great Books discussion group, larger discussion seminar type program that I'm in. But this is sort of an extracurricular thing we've been doing on the side. And it's been great, because I've been reading these things for the first time, not to write an article, not to do a podcast, but just for my own edification and seeing what I get out of it in discussion with others. And Shepherd of Hermas is no exception, in that the reason I bring it up is that there's that one of the few things I remember from my first reading of it is the bit about the I think it's the vine and the elm, this analogy for the rich and the poor. Do you remember what I'm talking about, Mike?
Kinda.
Yeah. I think the vine, I can't remember it that well because I haven't gotten to that part in my reread yet. I think the vine is the poor man. He's sort of held up by the No. It's the opposite. The elm is the poor man, and the vine is the rich man, because it's only
Mm,
by his aid to the poor man that the vine is able to rise up and bear fruit. Something like that.
yeah.
I don't remember how the symbiotic
There, there,
relationship actually works, but
but there's a lot of truth in that, and we all know that. I have a good friend who's paraplegic, has very limited use of his hands and his arms, so he's almost quadriplegic, and he has had
hmm.
to depend upon others um, all his life. Uh, and he was very bitter about this when he was young, and he used to express this bitterness often to his mother, and talk about how much he resented having to be helped all the time. And it was a moment when she just kind of had an outburst with him, and she said, they're not helping you so much as you're helping them. You're helping them to get to heaven. And so the substance of that parable that you're talking about is what she relayed to her son, that he had an important role in their lives. He was valuable to them. He was the one who would be remembered to them at Judgment Day, and he's lived to be a ripe old age now. I'm sure he's outlived many of the people who helped him through his life. So I
Okay,
think there's a lot to be said there.
yeah, Jeff has been expanding on his question. And first, also, let me say to Kevin Non-Tredicath says hello in the comments. Hello back to you. Please come up with a question for Mike if you have one. But let's read this comment from Jeff. He says, "I wonder if we have underestimated the place of caritas in the life of the early church." Let's see,
Absolutely.
the book by Peter Brown. He's been reading Poverty and Leadership in the Later Roman Empire from
Mhm.
2002. I actually haven't heard of that one. And then Jeff says, archaeology typically finds storerooms of items for the poor. Did the institutionalization of charity replace a key piety, I wonder? Now, I don't know what, maybe you know what he's referring to with this comment about archaeology, Mike.
I talk about this. Oh, I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about in particular there, but he is making an important point that in the early church, so much was placed on the impulse of charity. So much emphasis was placed on the impulse of charity, um, that people were expected to take care of one another and to take care of the poor, especially the poorest of the poor. So that when we find a description of the Mass, for example, we have two fairly good descriptions of the Mass, one in Justin Martyr, two in Justin Martyr actually, that are detailed, where he goes into descriptions of the Mass and talking about what happens at the Mass, even to the point of describing what we would today call transubstantiation. But he also talks about the the offertory collection, and he talks about why that's done, and then he's talking about what's done with the money that's collected. And he goes through this long list of charitable activities of the church that would have surprised a Roman, I think, because the Romans were big on philanthropy, right? Philanthropy brought about the conditions that kept peace in the empire. It kept the people satisfied with bread and circuses, kept them entertained, amused, distracted, so that they didn't rebel and that they were mildly happy about being Romans, right? So they could get their dole, they could go to the circus and see some violent entertainment, and everybody was happy at the end of the day. The Christian charity was something different. It was self-giving to particular other people, and the Christians were expected to be generous. So both Justin and Tertullian describe the Mass. They give descriptions of the Mass, and one of the products of the Mass is this charity that goes out into the world. And Tertullian, again, gives one of these laundry lists of activities that happen, that we don't spend that money on drinking bouts or parties or binge eating or anything like that. We don't use it for all kinds of feasts within the church, but we use it to feed the hungry. We use it to visit prisoners. We use it to go to the people in the mines and give them some relief, to go to those islands where people are in exile and spend time with them. There's a long list of activities that happen within the church, and we can see that this is very, very important to the church. This is a time of peak persecution, so Christians doing charitable activity would have not only drawn notice to them, but it would have put them at some risk too.
Hmm.
Tertullian has that great line that says that Christians wore charity like a brand on their bodies. Now, the slaves wore a brand on their bodies to talk about who owned them, right? Well, it's by charity that people showed that Christ owned them, that he was living in them, that he was directing their activity. Uh, you know, Tertullian then gives us the line that that the pagans looked at us and said, "See those Christians, how they love one another." And that's been transformed into so many songs in the modern era. We have to look back on these early ancestors and see what they did. You brought up Peter Brown, Jeff, and these books by Peter Brown are very good. This one, Through the Eye of the Needle, is about the conversion of some very wealthy celebrities in the 5th century and following. And it really is a remarkable story. It's as if you had the very public conversion of figures like say Bill Gates and Taylor Swift, names like that, where these people have a lot of money, and then suddenly what they do is they divest themselves of that money by giving it to the poor and giving it to the church. This became very controversial at the time because the rest of their family, their extended family, would be upset. This is the patrimony of the family, and they are saying by this activity that now we're part of a bigger family. We don't do these things in the old-fashioned pagan way.
Right.
We're part of a human family, the family of the redeemed, and this is the way we behave. So Jeff's on to something there. I think that there was a kind of impulsive charity in the early church that it would be good for us to cultivate again. It's very easy for us to say it's somebody else's job nowadays, because we have these institutions called Catholic charities, and they're doing wonderful things. They're enabling some wonderful things to be done on a grand scale, but it still has to be done on the neighborhood scale. It still has to be done on the scale of friendship, or it's not going to be happening at all. It's not going to be credible.
Yeah, well, we're starting to cook here with some questions. I'll read another one by Kevin in a moment.
Every now and then.
No, it's fine. Let me remind people that we're fundraising for CatholicCulture.org's May fundraising campaign. Any of your donations from now until May 24th, but preferably now, will be doubled. And we hope you can help us continue our work, all of our podcasts, our YouTube channel, and everything we've got going over at CatholicCulture.org. And to anybody who's just joined us, please ask Mike Aquilina any questions that you have about the early church, the church fathers. Okay, so Kevin has a question. What is Mike's take on why Justin Martyr never refers to the Gospels by the names we know of them today, instead referring to them as the Gospel of our Lord? Is this a good reason to think that the original Gospel manuscripts were anonymous?
Well, I doubt that they were anonymous. I think that he talks about the gospel more as the message that is above the Gospels, right? That the Gospels are expression of the gospel of our Lord, the good news of our Lord. So I don't think he's talking about the same thing as the individual Gospels. We do find from just a few years later, from Irenaeus forward, much discussion of the fourfold gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Irenaeus is insistent that these are the only four, because he knows that there were people trying to push other gospels that were of more recent vintage, including the Gospel of Judas, which we just recently recovered. So yeah, I think that when Justin says that, he's talking about the gospel generally, and then when Irenaeus is talking about the fourfold gospel, he's talking about the particular gospels that are canonical, that we'd call canonical now. The first canon that we possess is from around the time of Irenaeus. It's the Muratorian canon, which was found in Italy, but it comes from about the same time that Irenaeus was writing, 170, 180 AD.
Great. This question made me think too of a really interesting video that Trent Horn just did. I think it might be the only Trent Horn video that I've watched, but I know he's a quite popular apologist over at
He's
Catholic
good.
Answers. But he just did a video recently with the goal of refuting sola scriptura. But what he did was he went through the first couple generations of the fathers, um, and looked at how they cite the New Testament, what we would call now the New Testament. And I think he just talks about the Apostolic Fathers and maybe the second century, like Justin and some of those guys, the apologist era. And he looks at how they quote the New Testament and how much they quote it as scripture, with things like with introductions like "it is written," for instance.
Yes.
That they use always when they're citing the Old Testament, but very rarely when they're citing the New Testament. That not that they didn't believe it was inspired, but that they weren't yet conceptualizing it as scripture, as in the exact same category as the Old Testament. And so he was just using that to point out. It's quite interesting. He just goes through kind of systematically and in detail about some of those things. So Kevin has a follow-up question. Wasn't Irenaeus' whole point about the four gospels a theological claim, not a historical one? If I recall, Irenaeus' claim was that there can be only four gospels because there are four corners of the earth.
Well, that may be the case. So if we look at the historical circumstances in which he was writing and his expressed reason for writing the book where he says that, he's dealing with the Gnostic heresy, and there was a proliferation of new gospels produced by the Gnostics, okay, and they were all pseudonymous, okay. So they're Gnostics of the second century, writing in the name of Mary, in the name of Nicodemus, in the name of all kinds of people, including Judas. There was the Gospel of Judas, which Irenaeus deals with, and which was recently rediscovered. So I think we have to take that into consideration as well. That in his time, there was this proliferation of gospels, which was causing confusion among the faithful. The interesting thing about Gnosticism in the second century is that it really did not go out there trying to make new Christians. It was instead a parasite within the church. It tried to cultivate an elite within the church, a perceived elite. It tried to flatter people by saying, you're part of something special. The people around you in the pews, those odious people who are your neighbors, they're not part of that elite. You're special. You have the special knowledge, and you're going to be moving to kind of the secret echelons of the church. It was parasitic. It's interesting to note that when the persecutors wanted to wage war on the church, they really didn't bother with the Gnostics at all. They were not considered Christians by the persecutors.
Interesting. All right. Well, any other questions are welcome. I do have a question in the meantime for you, Mike, about going back to this third season of Way of the Fathers on the cities of the early church. Now, you mentioned you have to do a bit more new research for this series than for some of your past episodes. So you've got that giant library behind you, and I'm sure that, being in the world of patristics for as long as you have, you're not starting from scratch in terms of knowing where to look to find an answer to a question that you might have. But I'm not a researcher. I don't live in that world, so I'm just sort of curious about the research process when you're having to do more new research for something that you're delving into more deeply than you have before, because there's so many different things going on. And how are you finding all the different details that you want? Are you looking for books that have already sort of collected what is known about a certain city from the various scraps and pieces, or are you actually looking directly for little scraps and pieces in various academic works yourself, or how do you go about this?
All of the above. I mean, it's my privilege to have been friends with a number of people who were great scholars in the field, and when they died, they were kind enough to leave me their books. So I mean, that's what you see behind me is the books that were culled by by these great minds who've gone before me, including Tom Lawler, Thomas Comerford Lawler, who was the original editor, even though he was behind the scenes for the Ancient Christian Writers series. He was a close associate of Father Quaston, and they were friends to the end.
Mhm.
Tom left me a lot of the books you see, also a lot of his papers, which I found a home for. But I go through those books and I try to find what I can find there. Uh, I'm not looking for cutting edge scholarship on anything. I would like people to feel that they had visited the cities when they were done listening to this little podcast, that
Mhm.
there are certain things that are made vivid to them so that they can see the sights, they can know about the architecture, they could experience the city as a visitor might experience it in the time of the fathers. So I do look for the stories. I do look for the descriptions, the things that will make it palpable to people. There are so many things that I find fascinating, and I brought these up in different episodes. The fact that Antioch was really the first city to have streetlights at night. And those
Hmm.
streetlights were on the boulevard that was designed by King Herod the Great, the one who tried to kill the Holy Family. Okay,
Wow.
he created this street, this boulevard in Athens that was lined with lights at night,
Wow.
so that the night was illuminated and people could go out at night and shop at night and do all of these things that had been risky before, right?
Sounds
But
suspect.
it,
I think Chesterton probably would just take that as confirmation of the evil of streetlights, right?
well, he created the nightlife in Antioch, and then all of the cities of the empire had to follow suit, and they had to produce one of these boulevards that were lined with street lamps. Those little things. I also want to talk about the various synagogues that were in Athens, because there were or that were in Antioch, because there wasn't just one. There were several. And each one had a particular
Hmm.
character, and each one of those synagogues had a particular influence on Christianity as it was emerging in the city, and
Hmm.
then Christianity as it emerged in the world. So these are very important things, but they're kind of quirky little details that you're not going to find in other places.
Right.
I don't want to bog people down. I want them to be dazzled by these cities. I remember a description once of what a sailor saw on a ship as the ship pulled into the harbor in Alexandria. And you have to go past the lighthouse in Alexandria, which was one of the great wonders of the world, right? And they said, as you turned a certain corner, and you're facing the city, the sun would be glinting off the houses that lined the shore, and the houses all had this characteristic whitewash that was studded with gypsum. It was mixed into the whitewash, and it just made the landscape dazzling. That there was just, the light was dancing on all of these buildings along the shoreline. I find that fascinating, and
Hmm.
I get a kick out of it, because so many of the fathers of the church, the apostles themselves, must have seen that landscape
Right.
from the deck of a ship. That must
Right.
have been their greeting when they were landing at Egypt. So it's just something that they share with us, sometimes as an aside in their writings, and it just really appeals to me thousands of years later, and I want to share that with others.
Great. Okay, so Kevin has another question. Did you ever meet or know Father Raymond E. Brown?
I did not. My generation, he was of the generation before mine, so I use him a lot. I have a shelf of his books over there, but I never met him personally. No.
Okay, Jeff asks, how did Christianity come to Lyon?
That we don't know. At least I don't think we know that. It seems to have been there before Irenaeus arrived, and he arrived, and of course he becomes its first major figure. But he's dealing with a church that's already well developed. Uh, so many churches just show up on the historical scene around 170. Carthage is another example of this. We get our first glimpse of it with the Acts of the Silletan Martyrs around 170 A.D. And we can see a similar development in many of the churches in the cities of the Roman Empire around that time, around 170 A.D. We do see a pattern. They seem to have grown out of the Jewish synagogues in those cities, and every major city would have had at least one synagogue, because the Jews were dispersed throughout the earth, especially after 70 A.D., after the fall of the temple and the expulsion from Jerusalem. They would have been all over the world. They would have had these synagogues, and Christianity, it seems, in many of the cities emerged from the synagogues. That's a pattern we see within the Acts of the Apostles, and it seems to have been continued down through the centuries. At the time of Irenaeus, of course, because he was a celebrity, because he was an international figure, because he was associated with someone as notable as Polycarp, who was associated with the Apostle John, he would have been prominent, and of course his writing itself brought the church a certain prominence. But he too was just a major figure. He was called upon by the popes to try to mediate disputes between East and West. He was one of these what Pope Francis would call an airport bishop, apparently, because he would go to Rome to try to settle these disputes and mediate them. He also took an active part in the controversies of the time. His great work against the heresies is an engagement of the heresies. But we also have private letters that he wrote to these heretics, including one in particular who was a friend of his from childhood and a fellow student of Polycarp. So I don't know what the origins are. That's when it first appears on the scene. Same thing with Carthage. It just suddenly appears fully formed with these great voices like Perpetua and Felicity and Tertullian.
Great. Jeff, well, let me ask those of you who are viewing right now. I'm just sort of curious because this is our first live stream. And I was not sure exactly what the best way to schedule these things is. So did you, those who are viewing right now, tell me in the comments, did you know beforehand that this was happening and make a note to show up, or were you just sort of on YouTube and happened to see it and clicked into it? I'm just sort of curious because the YouTube stats say that most of our viewers are on Sunday afternoon through evening, and it didn't work out for various reasons. I think with any of our live streams this month to do it on Sundays, but I'm sort of curious if it's better to do them when people are just going to sort of wander in without planning on it, and they just happen to be clicking through YouTube and they see something like this. But so that's a bit of a technical question, but I'm just curious about how those who are actually here with us found this thing. I'm assuming you're subscribers to the channel probably, but maybe not. So Jeff has another follow. Oh, somebody new just came in. So let me reiterate. We are fundraising for CatholicCulture.org. Please help us continue our mission in the year to come by using one of the donation links if you're enjoying this live stream. And also, if you've just arrived, please ask Mike any questions you have about the early church. But until you get a new question, I'll highlight this comment Jeff made. We'll just keep dialoguing with Jeff here. Professor explained to a class I attended that travel was never as good as it was in the time of Paul in the Mediterranean area again until the 19th century. That's quite interesting. I mean, that has to do with that, all the world being at peace kind of thing, right?
I think that is one of the most amazing and providential facts of history, that just at the time our Lord was born, we find the discovery of the trade winds. So for the first time in human history, people are traveling on the open sea, and they're getting from Alexandria to Kerala in India in no time flat, compared to how long it used to take when they used to hug the shore. On land, we find the development of a worldwide system of roads for the first time, a worldwide postal system for the first time in human history. All of these developments that really were due to the genius of Caesar Augustus. but we have to look at the providential genius of our Father God, who was preparing the way for the gospel. That postal service would be something so useful to Christians, right? So much of what
Right.
we have in the New Testament is the product or the stuff that moved along in the postal service, right? And
Yeah.
the apostles moved on both land and sea, so they were using these roads. They were using the new trade routes and making the most of them.
Yeah. And, uh, that goes for cities themselves as well. This is something I think about sometimes because there's a lot of among Christians and conservatives today. There's a lot of anti-urban sentiment for many understandable reasons. Rebelling against what they see as degenerate trends in the cities, or even if not on a moral level, just sort of the low, what they see as the low quality of life and safety in cities versus the being in touch with the agrarian ideal of being in touch with the basic realities of life and the seasons and knowing where your food comes from and all that. So no, I that's obviously all very meritorious, but I do want to remind people that Christianity did grow in the cities, and the cities were a great place for that Christianity to the Christian community to develop. Also, that the kingdom of heaven is described as a city, I suppose a vineyard as well, but definitely the heavenly city in the book of Revelation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mike.
Oh yeah. I mean, Rodney Stark and Wayne Meeks and so many others have pointed out that that deviants find company in cities, right? Because there's this huge population, you're more than likely to find someone who's deviant in the way you are, right?
Right.
And
The
and
internet being the ultimate,
oh,
example of
sure.
that.
Right. In the ancient world, Christians were the deviants. They were proposing revolution. They were fomenting revolution. Now they didn't really see it that way. They said, we just love everything that's good in the world. Everything that's good is ours. And they would really try to find the good things in the pagan authors and the pagan scientists and pagan art and so on, and really make the most of those things. But as Robert Wilkin points out in his book, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, Christianity posed a genuine threat to the social order. What were these Christians doing? They were foregoing infanticide, right? Well, everybody knew that you needed to have infanticide for the sake of the family economy. You did not want to raise females because they were a drag on the family economy. So Christians called that into question, to say the least, right? By not doing it themselves, but also by condemning it. Christians also called the whole project into question by giving vocational freedom to females, young females, letting them decide not to marry, letting them pledge themselves to a life of virginity. This is so countercultural that the Romans were scandalized by it, and they saw this as a threat to the family, the traditional Roman family. If a girl could say to her father, I'm not going to marry the guy you chose for me, I am going to pledge my life to virginity. I'm going to pledge my life to Jesus Christ. Well, this was a problem, to say the least. So many of the lives of the early martyrs are based on this situation, that a girl turns down a proposal of marriage, and then she's taken to court for her Christianity, and she's killed in fairly short order because she refused to marry some guy, right? So Christians did have these deviant ideas. They were able to find each other in cities, and they were able to find other people who were willing to follow their deviant ways. And this still happens today. And I want to point that out because you're talking about these great ideas that are out there now about returning to the land and seeing how the food is grown and how the food is made and all that stuff. And so often these ideas are proposed by think tanks that are based in cities. Okay. So we still need those cities in order to bring the ideas and the thinkers together, at least in a virtual way.
Well, there
in
you
our
go.
day. Yeah.
I live in Manhattan. You live in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So we're a couple of city dwellers here. Now, although I grew up out in the woods, so look, I appreciate it. I'm gonna have to read. I'm really gonna have to read that Wilkin book. You've mentioned it so many times.
I love his work.
I also need to read that Fustel de Calange book that I keep hearing people reference. The Ancient City, is that what it's called?
Yeah, yes, that comes up a lot in my series to come.
Okay, so Kevin has another spicy question here. By now, I'm sure Mike has heard the battle cry that has been taken up by millions globally. Canonize Origin, you cowards. What are Mike's thoughts? How quickly should Origin be canonized?
Oh my. Well, I love Origen. I'm grateful for his work. He's such an important witness. He's often numbered among the fathers of the church, even though he was something of a problematic figure. Sometimes it seems disobedient to his bishop, sometimes going his own way rather than the way indicated by the church. Certainly, he fell into error in his speculative theology. Now, we should give him some leeway because he was doing this as the first speculative theologian in the church's history.
Yeah,
so he was the first out of the gate. He was experimenting, and if his experiments failed, well, that's because that's the way science works. But he often said, "Look, this is my speculation. If I am ever found to be at odds with the teaching of the church, follow the Catholic Church." There are so many instances of those words, similar words in his writings, that we see that it's a pattern in his thought. I do believe he was a great scholar, and I do believe he was a great churchman. He was a great figure in history. I do believe I believe he died as a martyr. He had this earnest desire to die a martyr's death because he had witnessed his father go to his death as a martyr, and that's something he wanted to follow from his father's life, and tried actually to run out after his father that day, but his mother hid his clothing so he couldn't go outside. He's a fascinating figure. And I believe he was a heroic figure. I don't know that he should be canonized because I don't know that we want to hold him up for emulation in many ways. I know that it's fashionable these days. Yes, you'd say possibly a eunuch. Yes, I think quite probably a eunuch, though I do realize that puts me at odds with one of the great Origin scholars alive today, who really, really is out there on the web, duking it out with everyone, trying to go against so much of the historical record and claim that he was not a eunuch. I think he likely was. He was that kind of passionate man who would go to extremes, and I believe that he did this, and even his admirers said he did it. So
I remember doing a deep dive on that question when I wrote my article on Origin, that series that we talked about, and like you said, some of his admirers even said that. I think the argument against was that maybe this admirer of his who said this was relying on an unsympathetic source for his information or something like that, some complicated reason. But
it's not ringing the bell for me, because I mean, we're talking about Eusebius, who made this, and Eusebius was relying on Pamphilus, and Pamphilus was a contemporary of Origin, and obviously an admirer of Origin. And
was Pamphilus the one who wrote the treatise on virginity?
I don't know. That doesn't ring right, but okay. I don't know.
I was thinking of some early father who wrote the first big treatise on virginity. I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Methodius of something.
Methodius wrote one. Yeah,
yes, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah. Interesting. So, all right. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? We've only got about 15 minutes to go here before we wrap up. But I appreciate Jeff and Kevin for asking so many questions. I know there's a couple other people in there, so please consider asking anything you want to know about the early church, or even if it's not a question. I know sometimes it can be hard to formulate a specific question. I almost never have I'm an interviewer for a living, and I almost never have a question when I go to a in-person event where there's a Q&A. So
also those other people out there might be FBI agents who are just lurking, they're on that beat these days.
That's true. Yeah, that's right. But Yeah. But even if you don't have a what you feel is a well-formulated question, maybe there's just a topic you'd like to hear us talk about. Maybe you just have a prompt. Questions are prompt like an improv prompt. Yeah, we'll see what comes up. I still wanted to ask you more about Sicily. How has visiting Sicily informed your work on the this new series that you're working on,
That'll
if
be
at all?
interesting to see what happens, because I just got back the day before yesterday at about 1:30 in the morning. So I'm still jet lagged a little bit, but I'm thinking about what I saw in Sicily. I don't have any Sicilian cities among my lists because there's an interesting phenomenon. When the church is at peace, it doesn't produce a lot of literature, all right?
Mm,
Because there's not controversial literature.
mm,
People aren't arguing with one another, and Sicily was pretty reliably orthodox during the patristic era.
right.
They could always be found to be on the side of the Athanasian faction, the Nicene faction in the church. And they could always just be reliably with the church. So the few places where there were disputes with Rome, those are well documented, and I mentioned them earlier. The idea of clerical celibacy and uh, and the reception of new Christians at the feast of the baptism of our Lord rather than at Easter. Um, uh, but there's not a lot to go on with the Sicilian cities, even though they must have been prospering at that
Mm,
time as trade centers. Sicily's the largest island in the Mediterranean, and you kind of have to stop there on your way to anywhere.
right. Jeff says, "I'm sorry you lost your dog. Puzzling how much we grieve our canine friends."
Hmm. Absolutely. And it really did hit me hard. It was a very hard day in this house. So many of my daughters came home to be with the dog on his last day. And it was deeply moving for me. Very emotional day.
Mm,
I'm feeling kind of drained. I actually did not have any dogs growing up. And so he's my
me
first
neither. Yeah.
dog. And we had him for,
Oh wow.
he's
Yeah.
my first
Wow.
dog, and we had him for 13 of his 14 years, and he and I were buddies.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Well, thanks be to God for that, that gift of friendship with the animal kingdom, especially in the form of dogs.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yes.
Um, now, Sicily. Oh yes, I was gonna say you were just in Sicily. I was just in Niagara Falls over the weekend, which was my first visit there, and
What a
I
place.
I got quite sunburned. But I didn't expect any Catholic stuff up there, but there were a couple of very interesting things. The parish right next to my hotel on the New York side has a big statue of a big plaque of Saint John Newman
Hmm.
because he spent some time up there
Nice.
in some
Nice.
kind of center up there, and they had a quote from him about hearing the sound of the falls, and
Wow.
also on the Canadian side they have Canada's national shrine of Saint Therese, which
Mhm.
I got to visit for a minute. So that was an unexpected Catholic element to the trip.
Yeah. Well,
um
St. John Newman has many associations with my church, Pittsburgh, and it's
mhm.
still a standing invitation for you, Thomas. When you're in Pittsburgh, I want to give you that tour,
Oh,
take you to the sites
absolutely.
associated with John Newman
Yeah,
and
that would be great.
Francis Selos and Catherine Drexel
Yes.
and so many others who either lived here or passed through our city.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that would be great. Okay, Kevin has another question. Why do we know so little about the early popes, second, third, and fourth century, like Pope Sixtus? Where do those records go?
Hmm. Where did those records go?
I don't even know if
They
we know
yeah.
what records existed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we do know a little bit about him. We know that Sixtus was renowned as a writer. He was, I believe, he was an African pope, and he was renowned as a writer. But we don't have any of his writings, so we're taking that as on others' authority. Um, I think that there were a couple of things that make it difficult. Um, Doing history in this time. One is that it was a time of persecution. It was illegal to own Christian texts, and it was not only illegal, it was a capital crime. So if you were found owning a Christian document, you could die for it on the morrow.
It better be a pretty edifying document if you're going to risk your life for it, not just a bureaucratic record of some kind.
Right. I'm looking back here because there are some wonderful books because, and I don't want to forget their names. I don't want to forget their. Well, I'll get back to them in a minute. But they're and in the climate in Italy and in most of the places in the Christian world, it just was not congenial to the preservation of paper. Okay, yeah. So if you were lucky enough to have escaped the Roman persecutors, the weather was going to get to you eventually. There was no such thing as acid-free paper in those days. In order to preserve anything, you had to copy it out by hand. And that was a rare skill, but you had to do that many times per generation. Where we do have some documentation of Christian life is in Egypt, because at Oxyrhynchus, we discovered this garbage dump full of paper, that was well preserved after 2,000 years, and it had so much just incidental correspondence and business receipts and all those sorts of things there in the dump. And so we're able to sift through all that and try to reconstruct what it was like to live in this city of Oxyrhynchus in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century. And there have been excellent collections of the fragments from Oxyrhynchus that have come together and been published in the last several years. And I own them. And for the life of me, I'm not seeing them on my shelf right now. So I can't put
well, they're
them
fragments. They're kind of hard to find.
I guess so. Now the books do pull them together in a great way so that we can see the correspondence between churchmen and that sort of thing. I find that stuff fascinating. It's the little details, it's the everyday life that I find so interesting, that we can use archaeology just to get an imaginative entry into that period in time. What a rare privilege.
Jeff, sorry, no, not Jeff. Kevin says, thanks for taking all my questions, even the origin one. No problem. That's what this is all about. Okay, we've got time for about one more question. If anybody watching has one, let me remind you, I'll just make one final appeal. And this goes out to people because I think more people are going to see and hear this after the fact. Mm-hmm. It's going to stay on YouTube after the live stream. And also I'll publish it on the Way of the Fathers podcast feed and maybe some of the others. And so more people will be hearing this. So to them too, if you're listening to this before May 24th, you still, there's still a chance to donate and have your donation doubled for CatholicCulture.org's May fundraising campaign. We need to hit the $50,000 mark to get our matching grant doubled. So so that's the last appeal tonight. But yeah, so if there's any other questions, feel free to ask one. I'll have to think of another one myself.
And I'll just say in the meantime that it will be so helpful. It's not like anybody is getting rich off this, but it is making something possible, and it's something very good, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Now, Jeff, okay. Is there anything left of the Antioch, which was the first Christian home outside Jerusalem? What happened to it?
Now that's a place I have not visited. But from what I understand, there is not as much that's been excavated as in other places. There's not as much standing, because it's in an earthquake zone. So a lot has fallen, a lot has crumbled over time, and there has not yet been the effort to take it out of the ground. When we see kind of the marvels of archaeology today, we're looking at things that were dredged out of out from under a lot of dirt. One of my favorite places on God's earth is Ostia Antica, which is a national park in Italy, and it's the former port city of ancient Rome. So it's acres and acres and acres of buildings that were taken intact out of the earth, where when the harbor silted over and the town kind of silted over, and all of these things were preserved. So when you go to Rome, you can see the Colosseum, and it's a strange thing, right? You see this first century building that's just there in the middle of a busy metropolitan intersection. Weird thing, right? But you go out to Ostia Antica and you walk the main street, and you see the cemetery, the necropolis. You go a little bit further, you walk through the fish market. You you go to the baths, you go to the amphitheater, you go to
Right.
the Christian basilica. We've even had mass in the ruins of the Christian basilica. But you're
Mm.
seeing all these things in their context. You're seeing all of these things as they were standing in the 5th century or so, because they've just been pulled out of the ground that way, with some reconstruction. So yeah, that I don't believe that's happened in Antioch yet.
Mike, let me ask you, what are some sites in Christian history that you haven't visited that you really want to? And it doesn't have to be from the early church either, but I'm just
Mhm.
curious.
Ravenna. Ravenna is number one on my list.
Mm,
Now I have not had an opportunity to get there, but that's the place where
Boethius.
Christian Boethius, right, and so many people before him, Peter Chrysologus, and so many other figures who were important in history, but not as
Yeah.
the history of the church. uh, the best preserved art from that early Christian period is there in Ravenna.
Hmm.
It's mosaic art. It shows the typology of the early church, because it will show side by side the Old Testament scenes, with the New Testament scenes they prefigure. It also shows the sacramentology of the early church, because it will show the Old Testament types, the New Testament fulfillments in the sacramental context of a church building, and they're placed there, to show sacrificial scenes from the Bible. At the site of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So I've seen pictures, I've pored over pictures from Ravenna, but I would really love to see that firsthand someday. And
Have you been to any of the Eastern sites or the Middle Eastern sites, the Holy Land, any of that stuff?
yeah, I went to the Holy Land twice. I've been to Ephesus. I've been to Corinth. I've been to Athens. Um, I've been to some of the islands, Crete, for example,
Great.
and Constantinople, Istanbul. I've been, and
Yeah, I went there for a day, just on a day long layover, so I didn't actually get to see any. It wasn't a very well planned trip at all, but I
mm,
got to see a few things. I saw the
yeah,
Hagia Sophia before they turned it back into a mosque. So
yeah, and a few others, Smyrna and that sort of thing. But
nice.
yeah.
Yeah, I need to make it to the Holy Land at some point. It's definitely high on
Mm,
my list. Of the places in Italy that I haven't seen yet, it's really the Tomb of Saint Augustine that I most want to visit. I want to say that's in Pavia or something like
yeah,
that, near Milan.
that's where his
Um,
relics are, right?
yeah, so I really want to visit that. I'm actually about to visit the head of my patron saint, Thomas More,
Mm,
in Canterbury. I'm going to be in the UK for about 3 weeks, starting in
nice.
late May. So that'll
Mm.
be a first time trip for me, and so I'm excited to visit sites associated with him, with Saint John Henry Newman, who is of course the patron of the Way of the Fathers podcast, and various other things, some Tolkien stuff as well, of course, but yes, a lot of I've got somebody who offered to show me around John Henry Newman related things in Oxford, so I'm quite
Wow.
excited about that.
I'm jealous. I'm jealous. My daughter is doing studies in England now, so
Great,
I'd love to be
great,
able to visit her too.
right. Well, I'm very hungry and I have to eat something, so I'm going to wrap this thing up. Thanks to everybody who was watching, to everybody who will watch after this thing is no longer live, and to Jeff and Kevin for your questions. Thanks for helping us keep this thing floating along. And thank you very much, Mike, for joining and hanging out here.
Well, thank you, Thomas, for the invitation to do it, and for all the work you've done long before I got involved with Catholic culture, and thank you for doing all you do to make sure it keeps going, that it stays afloat, that it's going to be doing this for a long time.
Great. Actually, I will add one more question from Jeff because he added an addendum to his question that I missed. He said, is there, referring to his original question about Antioch, he said, is there anything further east, India, for instance?
Well, that we could do a whole episode on that, because I am fascinated by the legends of the Apostle Thomas and his apostolate in India. Just There is so much that's fascinating in the oral history of India. There are so many references to Thomas's work in India in the Fathers of the Church. I did a little book on this several years back with a friend of mine, and it was called The Doubter's Novena. And it was just 9 meditations, really, on the life and the work of St. Thomas as it appears in the traditions, the Indian traditions, as well as the works of the Fathers. I find that fascinating. If you can lay hands on a book called the Tomapedia, Tomapedia, the Tomapedia, check it out. See what you think of it. It's a collection of scholarly studies by academics in India about the life and work of St. Thomas and the traditions that came from his work there. So I think it'll be an eye opener for you.
And a happy ending here. I see in our Catholic Culture donation report that we have just gotten 2 donations, one by Jeffrey S. Thank you very much for that. And another by Dave C. And now I don't know if Dave is somebody who's actually in the live stream here, or if it just is a coincidence that he happened to donate at the time that we were doing this. But if you are watching this, and even if you're not, Dave, thank you as well. God bless you all. And let me mention too, we've got 2 more live streams coming during this campaign on the successive Mondays. So next Monday, 8 p.m. ET, it'll be me and James Mayevsky, who is the host of Catholic Culture Audiobooks and the co-host of Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. We'll be talking about more Catholic arts and culture stuff. So you'll be able to join in our conversation there. And then the finale. So that's Monday, May 15th, 8 p.m. ET. And then Monday, May 22nd at the same time, we'll be with our 2 main writers at CatholicCulture.org, the founder of Catholic Culture, my father, Jeffrey Miras, and our news commentator, Phil Lawler, will be joining me, and we can have some conversations about current issues in the church and things like that. So please come back for those. Those should both be at 8 p.m. Eastern time. I'll post if anything happens to change with the scheduling. I will post about that in the community tab of the YouTube page. But as of now, just it really should be set solid for those dates. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. All right.